Welcome. We're thrilled to have you joining us today for a special live webcast presentation. My name is Chelsea Domenico, and I'd like to welcome you to our webcast on #MeToo, a year in the movement, featuring insights from our recent special report with EverFi. Over the next hour, you'll hear from the speakers as they discuss important issues raised by the #MeToo movement over the last year and how companies can and should be responding to this movement accountability. If you've ever joined us for an Ethisphere webcast before, you know we love to take your questions and answer them throughout today's presentation. Our goal for every webcast is to encourage you to ask as many questions as you may have. We love to make today's session as engaging and interactive as possible to allow us to have more of a conversation with you. So please use the question feature you see within the webcasting platform, and we are anticipating a handful of questions, so if we'll try to answer all of them throughout today's presentation. However, if we do run out of time, we'll follow up with you directly via email. Following the live webcast, you will receive an email from me, including the recording of today's webcast, the PowerPoint presentation you see here, as well as access to our special report. I'll quickly introduce our speakers before turning the floor over to Erica. I'd like to welcome Antonio Fernandez, Chief Compliance Officer for PSEG, Elizabeth Bill, Senior Director of Harassment Prevention at EverFi, and my colleague Erica Salmon-Byrne, Executive Director of the Business Ethics Leadership Alliance. With that being said, Erica, the floor is all yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much, Chelsea, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all of you, depending on where you're joining us from. As Chelsea mentioned, we do take very seriously here the idea that a webcast should be as interactive as possible. So please do send in your questions via the question function. I will be keeping an eye on that, and I will have absolutely no problem interrupting any part of our conversation to address a particular question that you all might have. I'm thrilled to have my co-panelists joining me today. Antonio Fernandez is, as Chelsea mentioned, the Chief Compliance Officer at PSEG, a fellow member, and somebody who has been active in the space for a very long time. So, Antonio, I will ask you to briefly say hello and introduce yourself and then I'll do the same with Elizabeth, and then we'll dive into the content.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. As Erica said, my name is Antonio Fernandez. I'm the Compliance and Privacy Officer for PSEG. I've been in the role for about 3 years, and prior to that, I was an executive at the compliance program. Before we start, I just wanted to tell everybody that, as you might imagine, with these kinds of presentations, I'm giving my own personal views based on my expertise and experience, but in no way do I need to represent PSEG during the conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Antonio. And Elizabeth, who is joining us in her current role at EverFi, but has a tremendous background in this particular topic. If you would take a minute to introduce yourself, that would be great, and then we'll move into the data.
Thank you so much, Erica, and I'm really delighted to be here and part of this conversation today. Again, I'm Elizabeth Bill, and I am the Senior Director of Harassment Prevention at EverFi. So I work with EverFi, which is a leading workplace training provider, to ensure that we are really using evidence-based best practices and in everything that we do, particularly in training in the area of harassment prevention. Before coming to EverFi, I was the General Counsel of the Society for Human Resource Management, or SHRM. And prior to that, I was the legal and policy advisor to the vice chair of the EEOC. And in that capacity, I helped participate in decision-making about the EEOC's litigation activities, their rulemaking, enforcement guidance, and the like. And prior to that, I was in private practice at a large global law firm helping employers with their harassment prevention and response efforts. So like Antonio, I'd like to give a brief disclaimer as well. I am an employment attorney, and so obviously my comments are not intended to be legal advice. They're not legal advice. You would want to consult with your own attorney to determine what your legal requirements are and your compliance obligations. So thanks so much for having me.
Wonderful. All right, great. So Chelsea, if we can go ahead and move to the next slide. The agenda for today is really looking over not only some of the insights that have come out of the special publication that we produced with the team at EverFi on the the hashtag MeToo movement, but also looking at some of the data and best practices that we're seeing coming out of our community. And I wanted to start just by setting a little bit of the landscape, because one of the things that we've heard from a lot of organizations is this is a topic that companies have been addressing or trying to address for a long time, that has suddenly become a more prominent conversation and something that companies are having to spend a lot more time on. And from a movement perspective in particular, we've seen a lot of very high profile activity over the course of the last couple of years. The slide in front of you here shows the cover of the special report, but also a variety of different headlines from things that have happened over the past year. And it's easy, I think, to get a little bit lost in all of that. The fact that this movement, this issue, this concern is not something that happens just at the very highest levels of an organization, that this really has an impact on employees much more broadly. And so one of the things that Elizabeth and Antonio and I wanted to do was to talk a little bit about what some of those impacts really look like, and what sort of an effect companies are trying to work with. And so, Elizabeth, I know that that there's a significant body of research on the impact that that culture and a culture in which individuals don't feel like they can bring their whole selves to work can have on an organization. But especially given your background and your experience, what have you seen, and what would you point companies to when they think about making the business case to address this particular issue?
Sure, and there's so many things that I could point to right now. I think there's two separate buckets really. I mean, when you're the pressures that organizations are facing to do something robust and to do something different is more present than ever. I mean, you can see these headlines, for example, that have really kept this issue top of mind. We've got state legislatures that have become extremely active in this area, obviously reacting to this sense that organizations may have missed the mark or not done enough in terms of their past practices. And I know we're going to talk a bit about that legislation in different areas, but that has put a lot of pressure on organizations to do more. We're seeing shareholder derivative suits. I see that you've mentioned stock prices and the like, but a number of shareholders are demanding different actions. There's really just been this narrative that we need to do something more. There's been a lot of headlines in the news that maybe training isn't working, maybe having a policy isn't enough. And to your point, the realization that the impact on the business and also on culture can be devastating has really been front and center for organizations as well. And I know we're going to talk a little bit on the next slide about the impact of harassment, but it impacts not only share prices, it impacts turnover rates, it impacts there's damage to brand and reputation, absenteeism, lost productivity. There are just a myriad of studies that show that there are really critical bottom line impacts to this, as well as impacts on the experience and attitudes of employees.
Yeah, and I think that's I think that piece of it is really a critical point, Elizabeth and Antonio. I'd be curious for your thoughts on this as well. But this idea, and we've seen this in data for a long time, that employees look to their manager or their manager's manager for cues on how to get ahead at a particular organization. And so I think one of the things that we see in some of these big senior level headlines is indicative of the fact that people have been looking to senior leaders for cues for a really long time. And so part of, I think, what makes the Me Too movement so interesting is that it is impacting so many people at such a senior level, right? Whereas, in years past, as we saw, for example, in the Google walkout, the protest that the Google employees had was really around the sheer amount of money that companies had spent over the course of time, paying off people who had brought these allegations forward without any, real significant consequence on the executives that were involved, and just the transparency that the movement has brought to some of those long-standing issues is a really interesting piece of all of this to me.
Erica, it's Antonio, if I may, on that. So as I look at this, the expectation that a company does the right thing, that really has not changed, right?
Yeah.
I think what's changing is what the general perception is related to what is the right thing to do in the face of an issue of harassment, discrimination, God forbid, an assault, and also the breadth and the speed at which information about these types of issues now travels.
Yeah.
And that the companies and the leadership teams are now having to explain themselves or demonstrate that they lived up to their values to do the right thing to people that they never even contemplated were going to be part of this conversation. Mm-hmm. And that Me Too and social media and the use of hashtags just created a ready-made audience that had an appetite for this type of information. It used to be that these kinds of employment matters, and Elizabeth is an employment lawyer, so she can speak more to this, but there used to be individual legal matters resolved between the company and the person who was the aggrieved individual. I think now with Me Too, it's a much more public discourse that you're having about what used to be a very private matter. Mm-hmm. And with the social media aspect to it, not only is it more public, but you have people that now, good, bad, or indifferent, might be suspicious of the company and of management as they act. They are ready to hear a narrative that may not be what's in the best interest of the company. They might be already ready to believe that management didn't do what they were supposed to do, that management was acting in the best interest of an executive rather than living up to your values or expectations. So I think what Me Too has done is sort of put a really strong magnifying lens on every single thing you do. And as compliance professionals, we know that there's a lot of things that we do every day, and our scope is very large. And maybe you didn't do a part or part of the process the best way you could have done. And now it's not just you and a plaintiff's lawyer trying to address that. Now you have hundreds, perhaps thousands of people commenting on social media about how the company handles something.
Yep, no, that's a really good point. And Chelsea, if we could hop to the next slide, we've got some data here that really exemplifies that impact that Antonio was just referencing. So to set this up for everybody on the line, these are data points out of the culture data work that we do here at Ethisphere. So we have a data set where we have been surveying employees on their impressions and perceptions of the ethical conduct of their employer over the course of the last couple of years. The data set on this one represents about 500,000 current employee responses, which represent the views of about 4 million employees. And one of the things we did for the research that we did, the report that we did with both Elizabeth and Antonio, is we cut the data to see what kind of an impact does witnessing harassment, not even reporting, not even necessarily being engaged in or a target of the behavior, but just witnessing harassment. If you as an employee indicated that you witnessed harassment over the course of the last 12 months, what impact did that have on your broader perceptions of the organization? And it really supports exactly what Antonio was saying. So if I witnessed harassment, I was significantly less likely to believe that the rules and the discipline at the company for unethical behavior are the same for every employee, regardless of their job responsibilities. This is what I call the animal farm test, right? Are all the animals equal, or are some of the animals more equal than others? You were significantly more likely to disagree or strongly disagree affirmatively with the statement that I believe our senior leadership team acts ethically at all times. And you were also significantly less likely to strongly agree that your coworkers act ethically at all times. So if you think about this from an environmental perspective inside the organization, you have people who are witnessing behavior that is having a ripple effect on their perception of the organization as a whole. They're less likely to trust their coworkers, they're less likely to trust the leadership team, and they're less likely to believe that the company treats everybody fairly in the event that something goes wrong. And all of those things have a tremendous impact on the organization. Employees are more likely to leave. Employees are less likely to be fully engaged in their workforce. And those things inevitably have an impact on the overall performance of the organization. So this data, this was a data cut that we had not done before, and I at least was really stunned not to see the correlation, but to see the degree to which these numbers correlated to witnessing harassment-related behavior. So Elizabeth and Antonio, I know you guys have seen this data before. I don't know if either one of you guys have any thoughts on that.
Sure. Well, I think it shows sort of the vicious cycle or downward spiral that harassment in the workplace can have, not only on the person who experiences it, but then everyone around them as they're watching and witnessing how the organization is handling it, and then just the impact and the impression it leaves on them individually. I did want to comment on that third bullet point. There is some interesting data that's not on the slide, but a study in 2017 found that women who've been harassed at work are 6.5 times more likely to leave their organization than those who haven't. So the impact on turnover rates and therefore productivity, another study found that an organization probably loses an average of $22,000 in productivity for every person who has been harassed in their workplace. These are real tangible results, unfortunately, of harassment. And this, of course, can lead to those, as you noted, the health and well-being impacts, which can lead to absenteeism, increased health care costs, and also, as just circling back to something that Antonio said, in our Glassdoor society, these effects will be amplified and communicated via social media in ways that they weren't before.
Yep, no, exactly right. Antonio, anything to add to that before we start to dive in what companies can do?
No, only to reinforce the point that, if you've done this kind of work long enough, you know that people do listen to our campaigns and our posters and our communications, but what sends the strongest message are those small social cues from leaders. And people read, meaning into behaviors, and behaviors matter, and perception can sometimes be reality. And again, I think that for this particular area, the traditional way of looking at it was a private matter, sometimes subject to some sort of claim or litigation between the company and an individual. And that's no longer the case. So people are going to infer or make assumptions about what the company's quote unquote real values are, or what we really mean about an issue, based on, the small amount of information that sometimes they have available to them. And it's important to impress that upon the business leadership teams, because oftentimes, while the people that deal with these issues on a day-to-day basis, they can appreciate that there's a change happening or has happened, that's not, I think, fully understood by the business leaders that we support. And I think they need to, it's part of our jobs to help them understand that there's been a sea change when it comes to this, that we see in lots of other areas related to culture, but in this one in particular, I think you see it most acutely, where if a business leader receives a concern, and let's say it's addressed and the company takes action, but nobody provides feedback, for example, or goes back to the person and tells them, here's what we did and here's why we did it, you are unfortunately creating a risk there that the person themselves and then anybody who they talk to will say, the company doesn't really care about those things. Even though they have zero tolerance, that's not my experience. And for this particular issue, I think that the effects or the negative effects are exponential. They grow, I think, much faster than they may for other types of issues.
It's a really good point, Antonio, and I know it's something that we're going to cover in the course of talking about what companies can do. But that last bit that you mentioned of the follow-up, because it is. I mean, if you think about the way that a lot of these have historically been handled, you go to your HR business partner, or you go to your supervisor, or you talk to a compliance person, or you call the hotline. And incidentally, the most common method of reporting a harassment-related concern, according to our data set, unlike most issues which come up through a manager, people are much more likely to go to HR or to compliance or to call the helpline, to sort of go outside of their traditional chain of command to raise a concern like this. But you do that, and that's an act of tremendous courage, right? It takes a lot to raise your hand for a lot of organizations, or for a lot of individuals inside those organizations, and they're concerned about the ramifications of it. And then for a lot of companies, it goes into this box, right? And the box is very black, and we don't really know what happens inside the box. And so, one of the things that Antonio and Elizabeth and I will get into is, how do you make the box a little bit less black? And how do you, inside the confines of understanding, what goes into an investigation, how do you make that just a touch more transparent for people? Because it really can have a tremendous impact. So with that set up, let's go ahead and segue into what companies can actually do in response to some of these concerns surfacing in a way that they haven't in the past. So Chelsea, if you would go ahead and hop to the next screen, and we can go one more past here. So Elizabeth, I was so excited that this was something that you were going to bring to the conversation, because I think it's a really interesting way of looking at harassment prevention, and particularly looking at not just what we've done since, in many companies' case, the 90s, right? You have a wide variety of state legislation that requires you to do sexual harassment prevention training, right? California's had their law on the books for a while, which is the longest, or the longest in time frame requirement, right, at 2 hours. But Connecticut has a requirement, Maine's had a requirement for a long time, New York has a relatively new requirement. The training in response to harassment is not a new approach, right? And clearly that means it's not always working. Right. So how do we think about this differently?
Thank you. Yes. And you can all see on the slide, this pyramid, I think, is a really fantastic framework for reframing the way that we approach harassment in the workplace. As Erica was just mentioning, we've typically, as organizations, tackled the issue of harassment through a discrete set of separate activities. We've had a policy that prohibited harassment, that prohibited retaliation, for example. We had a set of procedures that would have a reporting hotline or a chain of command to report through, maybe a set of investigation procedures, and then training, particularly compliance-based training. But the challenge is that like I said, they were sort of viewed as discrete activities that were often very compliance focused and also sort of incident response focused. So what do we do if harassment has already occurred? And the problem is that, and while that's critically important, we've got to have those policies and procedures and that sort of incident response focus to make sure we're handling issues that have escalated to that level appropriately and swiftly and the like. We are ignoring the front end of that equation, which really is, what are we doing to prevent harassment from occurring in the first place? What are we doing to create the culture and to create the climate that is hostile to harassment, in that where we're shutting down and addressing behaviors before they escalate into illegal harassment? So this framework is really an approach to take a more holistic view and a coordinated approach to the prevention of harassment in the workplace. And as you can see at the top of the pyramid, programming is what we're most familiar with. That's the training aspect that Erica mentioned. This is your annual or maybe biennial training that you would give to your managers or to everyone in the workplace. And we're going to talk a little bit about harassment training there. But it's more than that. It might also be communications campaigns, messaging campaigns, posters, including discussions about the importance of positive workplace behavior in meetings, all hands meetings or individual meetings. That programming has to be rooted in a very strong set of policies. I mentioned some of those policies, but also critically important to having the policies on paper is very strong adjudication and enforcement of those policies. Obviously, if a policy is not enforced, that itself sends a message and creates a culture of nonfeasance, if you will, as we lawyers like to say, but negligence really, or it allows things to foster simply because you haven't enforced your policies in a rigorous way. Policies, of course, should be informed, as should programming, by what we call critical processes. This is really using the business-related processes that you use in all other areas of your company to have a rigorous, data-informed and data-reinforced approach to your harassment efforts. So it involves studying your workplace data, whether through exit surveys, whether through climate surveys, and the like, to understand where are our pockets of issues. What is our time to investigate? Really having a data-driven approach to seeing how your systems are working now, and then using that data to inform changes to those systems. This also could involve having goal setting regarding what the kinds of activities or initiatives that you will engage in for harassment prevention. And then finally, all of this is rooted on a strong base of what we call institutionalization. This is the degree of system-wide buy-in and visible, meaningful commitment of your leadership in particular, but really everyone up and down, side to side of your organization in the issue of harassment and its prevention. How often is the CEO talking about this? Has your board of directors issued a mandate, and have you communicated that to your organization? How much funding does your organization have for training and initiatives and the like? Really, this is when you've achieved institutionalization, it has become a priority. It's a communicated and very visible priority for your organization to get this right. And when you have that, when you have all of these, then we've got really this systemic approach to tackling the issue, which I submit would be far more effective than these sort of pockets of discrete activities that we've engaged in the past that focus simply in a reactive mode.
Yeah, and Antonio, I definitely want to get your thoughts on the way that Elizabeth has posited this. Just a couple of quick things first. We got a great question from the floor about improving investigations, and we have a whole section on investigations. So hold that question for just a second. We're going to get there, I promise. But just a quick reminder to everybody that we are definitely open to questions, and would love to hear what you guys are thinking in response to any of what we're sharing. Elizabeth, one of the things we've seen a lot of companies do is look at that process piece, and whether it is through changing the way they approach harassment settlements. So, we've seen legislation that's been introduced at the national level to prevent arbitration or forced mandatory arbitration in these kinds of situations. There was the Gillibrand-Graham bill that was introduced in the Senate, but but some other things that we've seen going on. Individual companies saying, we're not going to require mandatory arbitration in cases of harassment, so people can become aware of some of what's happening inside these organizations. But you mentioned exit interviews and survey data. Turnover rates, I would posit, is another thing to take a look at, maybe by manager, if you're tracking that information. But there's a lot of different data that's becoming available to ethics and compliance professionals to help them start to understand some of these types of issues. I would, Antonio, I'm curious for your thoughts on this. One of them, of course, is what's even in your case management system. And I know that you guys have gone through a journey at PSEG to get all of your case management data onto one platform. So I'll ask you to speak a little bit about that, and then any other thoughts that you have on Elizabeth's framework.
Well, I think Elizabeth's framework is very helpful, and I as I prepared for the presentation, I had seen this, and it's something that I have challenged my team to think about, because it forces you to think about these issues in a more proactive way, whereas I think historically we've been very reactive to these kinds of issues, and only until you see that perhaps there is a trend that you start thinking about how you can proactively think about these issues. And I think what Me Too, one of the things that you can learn from Me Too is that if you are not being proactive about these issues nowadays, that you are already behind, in that the external environment and the appetite for these kinds of what can be somewhat sensationalistic stories is out there, and you have a ready-made audience that already is going to make some not so good assumptions about you as a company, as your culture. So when you're thinking about this issue, it really needs to move from this is an issue related to a individual matter issue where you have an employment claim against the company as to, what do you stand for as a culture relative to these kinds of issues like harassment, and is it really, as a company look at what your other cultural values are, do you really relegate them to something that you do if something bad happens, or do you normally have, practices, procedures, operational rhythms in place to ensure that you're, looking to make sure that there's no issues proactively? So I suspect that the latter is probably the better approach, and it's what we've slowly started to do. But for most companies, this is something that's new, that we're maturing in. So it's helpful to see, a framework to think about these issues like what we have on this slide. Now, relative to investigation management, concern management, I think the old adage of you don't know what you don't know is really what drove us to really consolidate our data sets. And when I talk to other compliance professionals in companies large and small, we all face a similar issue, which is the siloed nature of our data systems related to concern management, incident management. Different companies might call it different things. And, HR, compliance, audit, security, risk might have disparate data sets. And with the board and other external stakeholders' interest in really having a conversation about what's our culture, what are these different indicators that we have telling us, it made it so that we had a very strong business case to really consolidate a lot of our disparate data sources into one place. So that's how we got to being able to do this. Was, we got the board to buy into the concept that it was a good thing. It was an improvement. It would make us better, and senior management and the board could have a richer conversation about what our data was telling us. And for the most part, right now, it doesn't mean that the conversation doesn't happen, but it's happening with different parts of the organization. And so this holistic view of what do we look like is much harder to have if you don't have the data in a central place where you can just look at it from a high level and say, in this pocket, I have a harassment issue, I have other types of risk or audit or compliance issues. And it just so happens that, this is a new manager that just started there 3 years ago. So now you can start driving better insights from all these multiple things that you're spending money on, spending resources on, but you're not perhaps getting the full value of that.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Antonio. And a question that came in from the floor was, how do you treat cases that were not confirmed, either because the reporter elected to remain anonymous and didn't dial back into the hotline to give additional details, or the case was not able to be substantiated? Does that play into your volume analysis at all? And Elizabeth, I'll ask you for your thoughts on that once Antonio.
So it's a very good question, and I can't say that I feel that I have a silver bullet. I think you take the data. So we don't just look at our substantiated cases. When we look for trends, we look at substantiated and unsubstantiated cases, and we have various other measurements that we apply to the data to see if the data is sending us some sort of signal that we need to watch out for. And when we have those conversations, we also integrate the other assurance functions into that conversation about trends. So we do that about twice a year. And we look at organizations at the officer level, and then all of the organization that report into that particular officer. And we have risk, audit, compliance, and HR have a conversation about what are you seeing, and all those people are privy to the trend data. They don't have the names of the individuals raising concerns, but they do have at the high level of the organization who the officer is, and we look to see, are we seeing any trends? And oftentimes, I'm sure I'm not the only one, is having to field the question of, we see an increase in concern reporting. What does that tell you? And that's usually one of the most difficult questions that we have to answer as compliance professionals, because we have to balance the people engaging in concern raising is actually not a bad thing. It's a good thing. You want people to come forward. It means that they trust management, that they trust the process, that they've given you the opportunity to live up to their expectations. But at some point, is that telling you something different? So that's why including other people with other lenses and sometimes other data into that conversation is very helpful, so that you can then provide an assessment that's not just from one point of view. So it involves other of the assurance functions in providing a more complete assessment. So we don't discount them just because they're not substantiated. And as I often tell employees that I counsel myself when they come forward, when we conclude an investigation, it doesn't mean that what they told me was not true. It means I couldn't prove it. And those are very different. And in certain cases where we have a healthy level of skepticism about perhaps what happened, we do continue to monitor the organization through various means to ensure that there's nothing amiss, even though we were not ultimately able to substantiate the allegation.
Great. Elizabeth, any thoughts or reactions to that?
I just echo what Antonio said. I think even when an allegation is not found to have been supported by the evidence or whatever standard that you apply, it's important to track that for two reasons come to mind. One is, it often means that something is going on. It may not be a policy violation, it may not be an illegal behavior, but perhaps just the manager could use some more support and better communication, for example, or maybe there's some tense relationships that have a different root, or there's a different motivation going on. That I think HR would want to step in there and really try to get to the bottom of whatever dynamic led to that complaint. And the other thing that I would say is that, research shows that when focused on harassment in particular, that people who do engage in harassment actually have been engaging in lesser behaviors previously, and it's simply that their behavior escalates over time. They tend to be repeat offenders with their behavior escalating over time. So to the extent that you get these warning signs, these red flags with these lesser behaviors, you want to take a look at those and really stay on top of them, because if left unchecked, it's very possible that they will continue into harassment. So that would be advice for a situation, not legal advice, but advice for a situation where something hadn't quite reached the level of a policy violation, but it was concerning nonetheless. You would want to stay on top of it for that reason, among many.
Yeah, for sure.
Eric, can I just chime in on that? Because that's such an important point that
Absolutely.
Keep relearning. Wrongdoers sometimes, I would say more often than not, engage in different types of wrongdoing. And I have seen this play out again and again where, we're in the course of looking into something, and while we were not able to substantiate the alleged misconduct, that there were other things that we found in the course of the investigation or the review, if it wasn't a formal, that were other types of conduct issues. And I don't know, I'm not a psychologist or a behavioral scientist, but there seems to be something about this type of person that, if they feel they can get away with X behavior, they were likely engaging in Y and Z behavior as well.
Right,
Agreed.
which is part of, Antonio, where your point about pulling together those different perspectives becomes so important, because in the ethics and compliance function, you may be seeing X perspective, but somebody on the audit team or somebody in the IT department is going to be seeing Y perspective, right? Risky, cyber-related hygiene, or whatever the case may be. All right, great. Let's briefly cover a couple of quick stats on training, and then talk a little bit about the ways in which companies are changing their training practices. So Chelsea, if you'll hop to the next slide, this is just, and not a big surprise, the training response has been the primary response to harassment prevention for a lot of organizations for a long time. So the group is providing, training to managers, they're providing training to all employees, they're providing training in accordance with the law, and as the data shows here, 57% of our data sets are training at least annually, in some cases more often than annually, but at least annually to a majority of their employee base. And so the question then is, how do we make this more effective? How do we make this more focused? And so if we hop to the next slide, focusing on managers. And so, Antonio, you wrote about how you guys are thinking about training at PSEG, or you wrote how you're thinking about the program broadly in the Me Too report. And then our friend Katie Lawler at US Bank wrote about how they're specifically thinking about reaching their managers. And I wanted to highlight this just briefly because, this is something that you guys who listen to a lot of Ethisphere webcasts hear from us on all the time, which is really focusing in on your managers, because your managers are going to be the ones that create an environment where you can't get away with those other behaviors, or people are encouraged to speak up. They do feel like they can voice their opinion in a meeting. Off-color jokes are not tolerated by supervisors when they're heard in that particular environment. Whatever manager behavior is, a particular concern for your organization, really focusing in on that workplace environment set by managers and supervisors, and thinking about that as a primary part of the work that you're doing. And, Elizabeth, I know that you have certainly spent a lot of time thinking about training. So Chelsea, if we hop to the next slide, because I want to make sure we get to investigations. Elizabeth, how have you been thinking, and how have the companies that you've been working with been thinking about a different way of approaching what has, we've all sat through bad harassment training, right? It's not hard to identify the stuff that is not actually intended to impact behavior in any meaningful way, but is instead intended to just check a box. So how, if I'm an ethics and compliance officer or an HR professional trying to reach my managers, what's the first thing I should change?
Well, I think there's actually a few things that we need to change, because you're right. There's been a real collective understanding that the heavily compliance-focused, rules-based examples of egregious behaviors from case law type training has not been terribly effective at actually impacting behavior. So a few things to think about here. Number one is that, the research shows, particularly if you're trying to prevent bad behavior, that it's actually not terribly effective to have a consequence avoidance focus when you talk to people, when you're training people. It's the carrot versus the stick. If you tell people this is egregious behavior, if you violate this, then you will suffer these consequences, and that's the only message, that is actually won't inspire them to change their behavior, or in fact, it doesn't actually teach them what they should do. What we need is to have a positively framed training approach where we really teach employees and managers what positive behaviors, what positive standards should they be demonstrating, and what are our behavior expectations, and inspiring them and calling them to action to raise up to that healthy environment, those healthy behaviors, is actually far more effective, so says research, than simply focusing on consequences to be avoided. The second thing, and that's where you work in your values. Maybe you have a list of values, or your mission, things like that. That's your call to action on that. The second thing is having it be really solution focused. So, and I have here the engaging the healthy majority. we talked a little bit about who offenders, as I sometimes call them, or harassers, tend to be. There's actually not that many, as far as we know, people who tend to engage in the most egregious forms of harassment. And to really change their hearts and minds takes a really focused individual intervention type approach. And what research has found is that a far more effective strategy to shutting down their behavior is to change the social environment in which they sit. Mm-hmm. And that is to make sure their colleagues, in particular their peers, know how to communicate to them that their behavior is socially unacceptable. And it's peer pressure, really. And that is a far more powerful lever to getting them to change their behavior than threats of punishment. And so what we need to do is we need to engage the healthy majority of our workforce, those that are already following the rules, those that want to have a healthy environment, and give them the tools to shut down disrespectful behavior when they see it from these individuals. And that leads you to the third prong of really what research shows is effective to include in training, and that's bystander intervention strategies. This has become a bit of a buzzword. The EEOC task force report that was released 2 years ago talked about this. We've seen it in some media articles. But what is it? It is so much more than see something, say something. You can't just tell your employees if you see something, step in. That doesn't tell them what they should do. That doesn't tell them what they're supposed to see or how they step in. And very likely they won't actually feel comfortable stepping in because they don't know what to say, or that they'll be supported by their colleagues if they do put themselves out there and step in. So training needs to include actual simulations of language to use that can be situation dependent, and they can actually practice intervening in ways that feel comfortable to them, coupled with messaging through the training that indicates that your peers want you to help them as well. And if we all help each other, we will create that healthy workplace climate that we're striving for.
Perfect. Antonio, anything that you see here that you think, yeah, that's very much in line with what we're doing?
I think so I have this carrot stick conversation quite often. And in some organizations, I think what we all are aware is that there's this pull to focus on negative consequences. So if you do this thing, this other bad thing is going to happen to you. And as with your children, you all know that if you have children, that telling them, hey, if you do well on this, then we're going to Disney, or you're going to get that one thing that you want. That is much more over the long period of time encouraging changing behaviors than you don't get your dessert. And we're not that different as adults than we were when we were 10 or 12, frankly. And I think that the more mature programs really focus on talking to people about what kind of workplace do we want to be? Mm-hmm. How do you want your female coworkers to feel when they come to work? And at PSEG, one thing that we've been focusing on is how to be an upstander instead of a bystander, and what it means to be a good coworker. And we all know, we've heard about storytelling and how important it is, and leveraging stories from people's female coworkers about things that they've experienced in the workplace, so that people can be educated about it, particularly their male coworkers that don't share the same context that the female employees do. And sometimes it does take them hearing from somebody they trust and respect and they value about a negative experience to really open their eyes and say, I can be an agent for change in this situation. I would never want this person that I work with to ever suffer that. And that we've seen drive a lot of benefits. And it is, hopefully aligned with most of the companies, cultures that are represented on the call.
Perfect. Let's touch briefly on policy changes on the next slide, and then we'll talk about investigations, which is where a lot of this stuff ends up coming out to play in terms of the way that companies are thinking about their response to this greater visibility into what's happening inside of some organizations. So, we've seen, as I mentioned, some companies voluntarily doing away with mandatory arbitration clauses, voluntarily making changes to non-disclosure and confidentiality agreements. We've seen, as I mentioned, some legislation around this issue as well to push those concepts. And that's really about, sort of, as Antonio mentioned at the front end, taking this conversation out of the plaintiff's attorney to company context purely, and into a place where employees understand what's happening with the organization and what their commitment is to doing the right thing. And that's, of course, a balance, right? It's a balance that you have to walk as you think about the privacy of the individuals involved vis-a-vis the greater culture of the organization. But that is certainly something that we have seen as part of this response. And then this last bullet around greater transparency around investigations and settlements, and particularly the outcome of investigations. And so, Antonio, I'd like to hear from you in a little bit more detail. You referenced it in terms of following up with reporters and talking to people who were involved in investigations, but can you go into a little bit more detail around sort of how you thought about that transparency piece in particular?
Sure, and the how we arrived at that issue was, people. I said I've been here for about 3 years. One of the first things that I received was the results of our employee survey, which hopefully a lot of the companies represented here do. And one of the things that I noticed was this trend in the data reflecting people's trust in the investigative process. And one of the first things that I did when I started was assess the process that we had, and I found it to be very mature, akin to what I was used to at GE, where you had very sophisticated investigative resources. They were thorough, independent from the lines of business, and reading the reports and being familiar. I thought it was a good process. But what I started to realize was that there was an information gap where certain people that were involved in that concern management process were privy to a lot of information, but that the rank and file employee was not privy to even remotely the same amount of information. And what was happening was employees were filling that gap with assumptions. Mm. And as you might imagine, in this context, that those assumptions were not always correct, and were not always the assumption that was in the best light for the company. People were drawing negative inferences about what was happening. So that was the context in which we were operating. And what was clear to me was that there was an opportunity there that was not going to be very painful or expensive or resource intensive for the company, but that could drive a lot of dividends in many different ways for the program. And what we slowly started to do was to identify who were all the people that needed to learn about the outcome of an investigation, or who were the people that we weren't really communicating with. And at the end of that process, what we established was, at a very high level, we're not going into too many details, but that anybody that we touched in the course of an investigation or looking at a concern would receive a closeout. So whether you were a witness, whether you were the concern raiser, whether you were a manager, or whether you were the subject of the allegation, if you were aware that you were the subject of the allegation, all of those people received a closeout at the end of an investigation. And over time, what we've noticed is that the perception of this process has become more positive. And I don't attribute that to any material change to how we conduct the investigations. I attributed that to the amount of information that we're now willing to share with employees about the program. And I think there's a direct correlation between how transparent and how much information you share and how much trust you engender in the employee population in the program. And the more information you share, the more trust you gain. And There is a change there that has to happen. For most companies, you will have a very strong voice from the part of maybe Labor and Employment Counsel or Litigation Counsel that rightly is very focused on managing the litigative risk for the company and any potential disparagement or other types of claims that the company might receive against what I believe is a more stronger long-term important value, which is to get employees to speak up and to get employees to trust that when the company receives a concern, we do the right thing. And when you balance those sometimes competing interests, I think my personal view is that you err on the side of more transparency, because that will in turn result in more employees coming forward and telling you about all these things that you don't know about.
Yeah. Antonio, not surprisingly, when you've shared that, the question box has lit up. So, Chelsea, if you go ahead and hop to slide 13, we'll get into the investigation space, and then I'll pose a few of these questions to Antonio. And for those of you on the line who do have a hard stop at the top of the hour, we are recording this webinar. You guys will get the recording after the fact. So, for those of you who have a few minutes to stick with us, please do. But if you do have to drop, you can listen to the last few minutes of the conversation on the recording. So Antonio, the biggest question, sort of if I can summarize the flood of questions, they go something along the lines of, how much detail did you share? So do you share just that the case was closed? Do you share more than that? Does it depend on the circumstances? Does it depend on who was involved? Sort of what kind of guidance do you have for the audience on how to think about that transparency piece?
So generally speaking, it depends on the role that the individual played in the investigation of the concern. So I would say with the concern raiser is the person that receives the most information, and they receive the outcome of the investigation and the basis for the company's conclusion. So if we substantiate that the allegation was true, we tell them why. We at a high level, we don't get into the nitty-gritty details, but we tell them, we found evidence that supported your allegation that this person inappropriately touched you. So we do tell them that. And then in some cases, we tell them the type of corrective action that we're taking, whether it's it's in a general category, where it's disciplinary or some other type of corrective action like training or an organizational change. For witnesses, we share probably the least amount of information. For them, they get the status of the investigation, not generally the outcome. And very importantly, with everybody, we thank them at the very beginning of that conversation. And we thank them for their participation, and assuming this is the case, we tell them they did the right thing in either bringing the concern forward or being complete and forthcoming in an interview, whatever their role might have been. With the subject of the allegation, if it is substantiated, then that's a longer conversation clearly, and might involve discipline or other corrective action. And if it wasn't substantiated, they are told that it was not substantiated and that the investigation is closed. And on that, I'll pause for a moment. What I'll say is, for a lot of individuals that are the subject of allegations, it can be a very disruptive experience in their professional lives. And what we found from an organizational fairness perspective, it wasn't fair to those people to leave them feeling like there was this thing hanging over their heads. And here I'll do a very quick observation related to confidentiality. We are very circumspect in who receives information, including names of people or information that might reveal the identity of a person, particularly during the course of the investigation, because as with most companies, about a third of our concerns are substantiated. So that means about 7 times out of 10, something's happening with a person that's the subject of the allegation that ultimately is not substantiated. So we try to not share that name until it's absolutely necessary, so that we don't, harm anybody's reputation just by virtue of the fact that as human beings, where somebody tells us hey, this person had X allegation against them. Good, bad, or indifferent, most people think about that at some point. So we want to, eliminate the potential that would happen and that person be treated any differently because they had an allegation and ultimately it wasn't substantiated.
And that actually, if I may jump in, it is something that I wanted to touch on. That is a perfect segue right there. I would note, I completely agree with the level of detail and the reporting out to everyone that's been touched by an organization. I did that as well in my practice, and I think it's really effective in providing closure and also engendering faith in the system and trust in the employer. But on that last point, the other benefit of having all of those closeout conversations with everyone who's been involved in the process, including witnesses, is to reinforce your non-retaliation policy and to have not just simply say, this is a reminder, we don't tolerate retaliation against anyone who's participated in the process. That's important to say and really be firm about it, but also have a conversation with them about what is retaliation. I found this to be very helpful to say what it is and what it isn't. Individuals who participated in an investigation, whether as the complainant or as the person accused or a witness, are understandably on, especially the complainant or a witness, are on high alert or very concerned about what may happen following an investigation. And therefore, you want to help them understand, what might happen in terms of, people may feel a little awkward around each other, but we're going to work together to make sure we rebuild our team or what have you, and give them some really tangible advice about how to proceed forward in a constructive way with each other, particularly if the person who was accused was not exited from the organization. And of course, it's a really good idea to continue to follow up with anyone who's been in an investigation proactively after it's done to make sure that retaliation is not occurring. Because I would say, especially from having been at the EEOC, very often, or more often than not, as Antonio noted, the underlying allegation is not substantiated, but then emotions run high and retaliation occurs, and that will get an employer in trouble much more quickly. And that, in fact, is the highest type of charge that the EEOC is seeing these days. So you want to avoid retaliation at all costs.
Yeah, without question. And Elizabeth and Antonio, one last question that came in from the floor, and then I'll do my best to wrap this. Although I think we probably could go for another full hour on this topic without any issues whatsoever. But that is, if I'm someone who has been doing investigations for a while, this is a different way of approaching thinking about them. So how have you guys talked to people? How have you thought about prepping your investigators to have a different mindset in some of these circumstances?
Erica, your question is quite timely because my next meeting is to go do my meeting with the investigative team for the company, and it is precisely what I will be talking about. I did not talk to you about beforehand, so and here's the way I couch it to them. The investigators, I'm assuming that this is the case for all organizations, I think it is. The investigators are invested in that they are seen as fair and impartial and only driven by the facts. That's been my experience for people that do this kind of work. And what I impress upon them is that in order for them to achieve that reputation, that brand for fairness and impartiality, it is integral for them to have stakeholders, in this case, the employees, to believe that whatever they're doing it in a way that's fair and impartial. And there's very little ways that they can accomplish that by. It's not like they're going out there and talking to, scores of employees about the outcome of allegations and investigations. Most organizations, people don't do that. So if you have few means to accomplish that, creation of that reputation for fairness and impartiality, one of the things that you can really do as an investigator, and that you can control is what you tell the people that you interview about your program, about your process, about what they can expect. So it's impressing upon them the business case for transparency. That more transparency doesn't create more risk. More transparency over the long term actually lowers the risk for the program because it makes it that people trust you more. The more information you withhold from a person in a process that's so personal as a concern investigation, the more risk you're creating that that person is going to have an impression, make an assumption that's completely based on something that's not factual. Mm-hmm. And I have found that the investigators are actually very smart people, and this resonates with them. And, you know, we have different types of investigators, I'm sure, in our organization. I have found that even people who by training, for example, law enforcement people, who by training, they have to keep things very close to the vest. Even for that type of context, they see the value. And we have lived it where people that are getting closed out from our investigators where they're saying, you know, we did not substantiate X, Y, Z, the people are thanking them. So that was not a consistent experience beforehand. And I tie it directly to the fact that we're being a lot more transparent with people at the beginning of the process and at the end of the process. And I think it's in the doing that you sort of prove that to people. But, you know, our experience here has very much borne out that once the investigators start seeing people reacting to the program differently, providing different type of feedback, it sort of reinforces that those are the right behaviors.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting, Antonio. Thank you. I'm going to give Elizabeth the last word and let you go to that meeting. Thank you for the 8 extra minutes, going above and beyond the top of the hour. Really appreciate it. Elizabeth, anything to add to Antonio's wrap up there?
I completely and 100% agree with what he said. I think that it is so critical to be transparent about the process, because that will engender trust in the system, particularly if for legal reasons or confidentiality reasons, we can't be as transparent about the outcome, perhaps in terms of detail or the people involved. So people will find comfort and will appreciate the transparency about what to expect, what impact, you know, what will you expect of me, and assurances that it will be fair, impartial, prompt, and the like.
Yeah, absolutely. Elizabeth, any last thoughts from you on training investigators together? So Antonio mentioned this a little bit. He's got investigators that have different backgrounds, that work in different functions. What do you have thoughts on how important it is to get your investigators together with some level of regularity?
Well, I'm a big training proponent, no matter who your audience is in particular, but obviously there are a lot of incredibly complex skills and that are required to be an effective investigator. Everything from questioning techniques to how you document what you find, how you your body language, the words that you use, and of course following the process that you have in place in your organization for those fair and impartial investigations. So yes, I think in order to keep your investigators really at the top of their game and using the best techniques that we know of, it's important to have ongoing learning for those investigators.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, with that, my thanks to you, Elizabeth, for taking the time to join us today, to Antonio for taking the time to join us today, and to our audience for taking the time to join us today. If you submitted a question that we did not have a chance to get to, we will follow up in writing as best we can following the webinar. Everyone who registered will get the recording and the slides, as well as a copy of our special report, #MeToo, a year into a movement, that has further insights from Elizabeth, from Antonio, and from a variety of members of our Bella community. So thank you all so much for taking some time out of your day today to talk to us about this critically important topic, and stay tuned for much more from the rest of us here at Ethisphere.
Thank you, everyone.